Hello, everybody. I'm here with Gary Edwards, British philosopher, and I'm me. And I think that's introductions out of the way. Gary, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think I am me is an excellent philosophical point.
All right, then. So today we're going to be talking about sort of the progenitors of standpoint epistemology, general intersectional epistemology. There's some very interesting connections that I think you alluded to in one of your videos between Sandra Harding and Patricia Hill Collins. I want to go over that as well. I kind of want to go over sort of the development, the first, the elephant in the room, Thomas Kuhn. He's an interesting figure, isn't he?
Oh, certainly, yes. I mean, he's very much a key figure in the late 20th century history of the philosophy of science. But the question is he a goodie or is he a baddie? Did he open the floodgates to a terrible relativism, or is he misunderstood? I tend to go more towards misunderstood. And I think the things that he said were certainly taken up, and certain people ran with them in a certain way that's not entirely satisfactory. But whether that was his intention or not, well, I have reason to doubt that he was sort of like an anarchist, like a Feyerabend or anything like that. I think he was a little more circumspect and a little more bound to reason.
Yeah, I do know that he did disavow Feyerabend. He did express frustration that he and some others, I don't know if he ever commented on Harding or Foucault, but I do know that he wasn't really happy with how some of the more radical types ran off with his ideas.
Certainly. I mean, there was towards the end of his life, one of the last correspondences, private correspondences, to one of my ex-professors actually was he actually said, I never meant to impugn the rationality of science, which I think is a rather sad kind of ending to a career, a life in philosophy of science. I think he was very much aware that people had run with his ideas in a certain way, and that they basically done with it something that he never intended to do.
Yeah, I also heard though that toward the end of his life, he did express kind of more radical views with regard to sort of the logic of science, about whether it really does represent any kind of genuine, model of reality. I have this book here by Steven Weinberg. It's called "Facing Up: Science and Its Cultural Adversaries." Are you familiar with it?
I'm not, no.
It's a collection of his essays, and he writes here a couple of them about Thomas Kuhn, who he was apparently friends with. And he sort of expresses kind of, he agrees with Kuhn on certain aspects of his philosophy. With normal science, he generally tends to be in agreement, but he's not entirely sure about the paradigm shift part. He seems to be suggesting that Kuhn's entire model for the paradigm shift comes from the change from the Aristotelian view of physics to the Newtonian view of physics. He says that Kuhn, at one point in his life, had this kind of epiphany where he was able to see the Aristotelian physics, and he was able to really intuitively understand why, why Aristotle believed what he believed about physics, which is, we now know to be not great. And when he sort of switched between this and the Newtonian view that he was better acquainted with, it sort of occurred to him, maybe this is the model for how all of science evolves. And Weinberg took it.
Yeah. That we change from, say, a paradigm which is Aristotelian in its conception, and then something comes along and we have a sudden radical shift into the more kind of Newtonian model.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, and he disagreed with him. Weinberg disagreed with that.
Yeah, Weinberg took issue with the generalization of this to the entire scientific enterprise. I think that Kuhn was sort of pigeonholing all of science's developments into this kind of narrow model that only applied to this one special case with the birth of modern science.
And was extremely dramatic. Was when he's one of the most dramatic changes. That and the shift from the Newtonian to the sort of Einsteinian are probably the two most dramatic shifts you can think of. Maybe it isn't always that dramatic. Maybe it's a bit more piecemeal. Well, I think those are valid criticisms, especially if you take the Kuhnian paradox, the Kuhnian approach to be entirely revolutionary, as if there's always a light bulb moment and a great parting of the Red Sea every time science progresses. Then yeah, that's obviously not the case. So yeah, you could make that criticism, but is that what Kuhn was claiming in essence, or is that the way certain people have gone with the interpretation of Kuhn?
Well, my reading of Kuhn is colored by the person who first presented it to me. I took a course in my undergrad, and I didn't realize it at the time, but the person running it was a radical constructivist. I speculated at the time that, I speculated at the time that she was a creationist because, I'd never been acquainted with this kind of arguments before. The way she presented Kuhn, she started out in the introduction. She was basically suggesting that the theory of evolution and of natural selection in particular was inspired by capitalism. Darwin, living in Victorian times, this was basically a naturalized endorsement of capitalism. And I was like, okay, let's say that's the case. Let's say that's true. So what? The model works. And this kind of argument that sounds suspiciously like something I railed against before in my videos, where I'm talking about, how some creationists will say, yeah, we have the same evidence, but we have different interpretations of it. There's the evolutionist interpretation, there's the creationist interpretation, and they're both religions and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and I thinking back, I realize now she was probably referring to Quine's underdetermination. But
well, yeah, Quine's underdetermination doesn't entail that it's all capitalism's fault.
Sandra Harding might disagree.
Well, that's the difficulty, isn't it? There's a certain type of reasoning that's pretty much got its mindset on where it wants to go, and it has certain attitudes towards what you could call the positivist model of science, and what that's all about. And it's very eager to reach those conclusions. But this is always the problem when people approach something with this is going to blow your mind. You should always be a bit suspicious, because to blow your mind, first you've got to get to the just makes sense, seems plausible stage before it strikes you like a great sort of like revelation. And I think that the just makes sense and is a sensible idea part of the paradigm shift approach is that when we look at the history of science practically, we do see that it changes. The ideas change, theories change. What's under test is more like a theory. It's like a framework. It's the web of belief, Quine's web of belief. That's what's under revision. Not rather than the positivist idea, perhaps, that it's particular propositions, denoting propositions that are under revision, that are key or set out in natural laws and conditionals. Rather than that, it's more like a theory. It's like a framework. It's a network that's under revision.
Yeah, I'm down with this more holistic kind of view of but what Kuhn seemed to be suggesting, especially with the incommensurability part, was that you don't really have so much a revision of theories as you do have a jump from one theory to another, as opposed to the more, what I would see in the history of science as being theories being generalized. You have a phenomenon.
Commensurability can be interpreted more narrowly than that, as just as one theory is incoherent with another. They can't both be true, or this part of the theory that's about phenomena X can't be true if this other alternative theory about phenomena X is true, even though they may belong to a broader structure that is coherent. So it can be more about a localized coherence commensurability than a complete overhaul. Because I think one of the problems is that people think, well, look, they'll think, complete overhaul of a theory, and they'll snap into Hegelian history mode, and they're like, what was the zeitgeist doing? Oh yeah, this is what this is all about. Oh yeah, quantum mechanics is about the Germans trying to look important again after the First World War. That's what quantum mechanics was about. They'll go into that line of thinking. Well, that might be a leap, you know. And the problem it leads to, which is I think where we have the problems we have now, is that it can lead people to thinking, well, you know, reason can't hold the line. That ultimately, what determines one's epistemology. We're getting into Sandra Harding territory here.
Mm-hmm.
What determines one's epistemology is one's sort of broader identity, the context, the social context, the performative social context. That's what it's all about. There's very little room for individual reason or reflection, as if you can't, the individual scientist or the particular research group can't abstract itself from its larger identity. It's somehow determined by that. It's where that kind of Hegelian thinking starts to come in, and I don't think that in itself follows from generally what Kuhn was part of, which is the post-positivist approach, the idea that we are dealing with theories in the way that theories sort of influence our perception, which comes from Quine and of course Sellers. So I think he started off by saying that, but he was saying it at a time where there was just a general movement away from the positivist approach, and he got swept up in the political aspects of what was going on at the time in the 60s, and it went a certain way, to the point where people were saying reason can't hold the line, that truth is your truth, or truth of the group that you happen to belong, your standpoint, and the standpoint of the privileged is not the standpoint of the underprivileged. And off we go.
Yeah, here's the master-slave dialectic, right?
Well, that's what it's rooted in. Yes, it's rooted in Marx and Hegel. Yes, it's rooted in that kind of conflict between there's one group of the privileged, and then there's another group who, oddly enough, are defined by the negation of the privilege. So the privilege is still in control, oddly enough, and that sets it almost sets your ontology. It almost sets the account of what exists in which the discourse then takes place. There's the privileged and the underprivileged, and you get a kind of, you can argue, you get, rather than Hegel, you get a kind of Nietzschean slave morality, where that which is low, that which is underprivileged and oppressed, becomes good, and that which is privileged becomes evil. And that's Nietzsche's origins of good and evil. You know, and so you get those kind of dynamics coming in. Now, as interesting as they may be from a perspective of storytelling, I'm not particularly sure that they're useful by the time we come to testing our beliefs against evidence. Mm-hmm. You know, but by the time we get to if we want empirical truths, if we're trying our best not to be wrong about things, I'm not sure that is the best approach that people can take.
They do make a distinction, though, between the noumenal and the phenomenal world, though, and they'll
deny the noumenal. They'll deny the noumenal because there's a strong influence of transcendental idealism in this line of thought.
Yeah, and because it's all phenomenal, and because sort of the only way we can share our mental states, affect each other's mental states, is through language.
Sure. And the hard science, the natural sciences, will be attributed to as being noumenal in nature. You'll often see that with social scientists. They'll claim that scientific truths are analytic, but social science truths are more synthetic, or just what they call facts, and they'll make a distinction between facts and truths, which is really bizarre. I don't think that define that much anywhere else.
Yeah, it's strange. Let me think. This sort of talk about how language shapes our mental states, and how, you know, based on whatever culture you're situated in, you know, you have all these different linguistic conventions, and this all sort of shapes this
language games and the like.
Yeah. This is sort of the beginnings of post-structuralism, isn't it?
Yes, that it obviously takes up that form of thinking, but again, under the framework of transcendental idealism, in that the necessary conditions for comprehension are taken as being of the mind, and the mind is primarily taken as being semantic and performative. It's the performance of semantic acts that actually make the mind. Now, to some degree, that's true. Obviously, we as well as an ontology. When we do psychology, when we do any kind of theorizing, we don't only have an ontology, we have a semantics. And the semantics isn't necessarily just a reference to the ontology. There are other approaches to semantics, meanings of words, like that based in the use of words. The performances of various actions, and this is all very true, but again, the issue comes down to where you think you can draw a line and be reasonable and make appeal to, for example, cogent argument, a good argument, or the kind of epistemic virtues of good science.
Oh, well, now you're being philogocentric.
Yeah, that's the people who are the problem. The people who will say that, they'll say, well, this is just white male control. That it's just ideal theory, like Charles Mills. I'll just say, well, if you use, which is exactly what happened in the recent Hypatia case with Rebecca Tuvell. No, there were people citing Charles Mills, saying, well, she's making a rational argument, but she's using the wrong vocabulary, and she's sort of dead naming Caitlyn Jenner as Bruce and at one point, and all this kind of thing. And the objection was that, well, this is, she's making an argument, and the arguments are an argument you'll find in philosophy, where you say, well, if you stick with this kind of reasoning, you can't hold on to, you can't talk about one case in this way and one case in another. You have to be consistent to the argument. And they're saying, well, that's just ideal theory. It's abstracting away from the suffering of real people. And that's a similar kind of thing. It's saying, well, look, reasoning is just white male power, or it's Enlightenment thinking. Enlightenment thinking is essentially the oppression of Africans by the white European tribe.
How do you get to that point? How does one achieve
You
this?
want to get there. First of all, you really want to get there. And secondly, you have enough people in certain departments who think it's a cool and trendy enough thing to say, to make a bit of a rock star out of you for saying it. That's how it happens. Base as that.
Yeah, it's a little bit mind-blowing thinking about how this even managed to creep its way into the academy.
Yeah, well, it is, yeah. I mean, but then, do you think intelligent, educated people are beyond sort of this kind of wishful thinking, this kind of driven thought and interest?
Well, no, but I would think that the system that the academy has in place would filter out these kind of ideas over time.
I think it's more like a two cultures thing, in that they, as you know, because you're doing your series on the science wars, it didn't go down it wasn't swallowed universally. There's a lot of resistance to this kind of thing if you come from the kind of right departments and the right sort of institutions.
Yeah, so some of these departments are very entrenched. They have a kind of bunker mentality, don't they? They're really isolated from the rest of the university, but they still have a huge impact on the kids.
Sure, because they're teaching humanities courses and things like literature and women's studies, and these are getting in the heads, the numbers, and and Marxism isn't the only ideology that's a threat to the university. Capitalism can be pretty bad as well, So they can if these are getting the numbers in, they'll and getting the publications and getting the scores, then they'll have some say. They'll be listened to.
Well, ain't that an irony?
Isn't that an irony? Yeah. But that's not because argumentum ad populum. Just because these people are these courses, these particular sort of approaches of drawing people in, and then regurgitating that and pushing them into the mainstream media and into places where they can be sort of thought leaders effectively, then they gain some kind of cultural power.
Yeah, especially with the rise of social media. 2012, the Obama's re-election, there was a huge emphasis on social media, and people realized, hey, these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they have this kind of potential for political change.
Sure.
And the next thing you know, we have these college students remembered lectures about white privilege and male hegemony and so on.
But also resistance. That's also the resistance has been a lot stronger on certain parts of social media, of course. But it does have power. This is why it gets. And this, of course, is the irony of ironies, because they're all on the bet that there's a very much kind of focus on power and influence being used to corrupt the quality of epistemology and thinking. But not in their case, only in the case of the people who they oppose politically, which should be a bit of a warning that something's going on. That's not entirely wise.
Yeah, it's always struck me as ironic that Lyotard was very busy checking other people's meta narratives, but never really examining his own.
Oh, sure, yeah. There is hypocrisy there. There is hypocrisy in many postmodernism is afflicted with a certain hypocrisy. People often do not act in accordance with the principles they expose. People don't do that in general, but there's I don't know. Maybe I don't like postmodernism. I think it can be a bit arrogant, even though it's trying to be incredibly humble and say, "Oh, we don't do grand narratives." Maybe saying I don't do grand narratives. Maybe saying, oh, well, we've bracketed metaphysics. Maybe saying we've bracketed these issues is the problem. Because if you think you're beyond them and you've bracketed them, you don't think about how you could be doing it wrong. You actually isolate yourself from criticism, which is the complete inversion of philosophy. So and science. It's the complete inversion of both those disciplines. The key is be critical, be self-critical. And don't put anything that you want to believe beyond reach of being, given a serious shaking down against evidence. And that can breed a fair amount of hypocrisy and conceit, I'm afraid. So they have power. They do have influence. But what they don't have is homogeneity. They don't have complete control. There's a great deal of resistance. There is resistance, which is what happened with the Toovel case as well. There's a lot of people who've come out in her defense, and the defense of reasonable argument as a means of examining our presuppositions. Even if it isn't cast in the language that a group deems appropriate.
It seems that one of these cultures is more interested in understanding the world and interpreting it, while the other one is more interested in simply changing it without regard for whether they understand it or not.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, or at least they're not as critical of their understanding as maybe the STEM side is, the natural science is. Because let's face it, if Kuhn was correct, and it is a continual sort of testing and squeezing and stressing of the paradigm, then of course the natural sciences are going to be much more reflective and self-reflective. That's what it's all about. It's about testing the framework to destruction. And this is why there's a good case for interdisciplinary communication in the natural sciences as well, because changes, you can learn a lot from what other disciplines are saying, including interesting approaches to methodology. Some of the best, as you know, some of the best advances in small scale physics have come from cosmology, from looking at stars and going, what's going on there? I wonder if it could be something like, and then drawing something from a completely opposite end of the energy and scale. It's self-testing, and I think that what you could say is that the natural sciences perhaps are more self-critical than their critics that in the humanities give them credit for. They think that they'll go on at length, like Sandra Hodgins. She'll go on at length about, well, it's all funded by the military and the government, and that as if that determines the validity of the science, or as if that determines how it is to be viewed, even in a social context, rather than a pursuit of truth. Now, is it a totally disinterested pursuit of truth? Nothing's totally disinterested, but I don't see anybody in the humanities using randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled tests like people in the, say, the medical sciences do. I don't see any apparatus like I don't see much apparatus like that in the humanities. It's pretty much it seems to be quite phenomenological often. It's things are given and quite qualitative, as if a qualitative phenomenological expression of the phenomena somehow is evidentially important.
Is this really a contest between qualitative and quantitative? Because I get hit with that a lot.
No, look, any science will have a combination of both. Yes, any empirical science will be a combination of the qualitative and the quantitative. The distinction, as if the distinction is a proper distinction that separates one field of study from another, is ridiculous. All sciences are quantitative and qualitative. It's the approach you take to testing the theories by which you interpret the qualitative that seems to be the difference. In that how careful are you, and how much of an acknowledgement do you make that your conclusions are a result of interpretation via theory? So I think you could have. I think both. Well, as you know, I think should be a much bigger role for natural models in social science, social sciences.
At the end of the day, though, shouldn't the benchmark for determining whether the theory is valid or not be whether it accurately makes predictions about future data?
Sure. I mean, and Kuhn himself, I think sometime around 1977. I can't remember what thing's called now, but he made suggestions as to what a good theory should be like. I think it was objectivity, value, judgment, and theory choice. I think the paper was called. But yeah, there are criteria that mean it's not relative. There's things you want from a good scientific theory. You want accurate prediction, clearly. Yeah, but you also want some aspects of explanation that are good as well. You want explanations that are efficient, that aren't too easily that can be falsified, that aren't so flexible explanations that you can fit them to anything. Yeah, there's a host of criteria, virtues, if you like. It's almost like epistemology becomes a form of virtue ethics. You're looking for certain virtues that if a methodology has these virtues in its pursuit of the truth, it's better than one that doesn't, regardless of culture or extraneous political issues. There are certain things, there are certain features of the human mind, certain faults of the human mind that make certain methodologies better than others. We should go with the better one so that we better understand the world before we try to change it, lest we fuck it up by mistake.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we move on to Sandra Harding, her sort of Kuhn and Quine, because I was under the impression that Quine was one of the good guys. And
I think Quine is a naturalist. I mean, Quine is responsible for epistemic naturalism and a closer ties between the natural sciences and certain fields of philosophy like epistemology. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in her 1986 book, she outlined 3 separate feminist epistemologies. There's the standpoint theory. There's the more postmodern one. I don't remember if she called it the postmodern epistemology, and then there's the feminist empiricism.
Mm-hmm.
And what's curious to me because Harding seems to me to be sort of the architect of, she's trying to synthesize all of these different epistemologies over her career. She's trying to bring them all together into one sort of broad general epistemology, or rather a template for epistemologies onto which other master-slave relationships can be projected. Not just male and female, but later on, black and white, gay and straight.
By the early 90s, she's into intersectionality, yes, as was everybody at that point.
Yeah. Well, intersectionality, here's my understanding of the development of its history. You have Crenshaw in the 88, 89 paper doing it from critical race theories, sort of legal view. She coins the term, but she doesn't really develop it. That's Collins's job a couple of years later in Black Feminist Thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of critical race theory, Yeah. Speaking of CRT, by the way, I read this excellent book by Farber and Sherry. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Beyond All Reason.
Oh yeah, I know it. Yeah, it's a good book. Yeah,
I like it. Yeah, just thought I'd throw that out there. But 91, I read Black Feminist Thought, and in the epistemology section of that book in particular, I was very surprised to see Sandra Harding's name come up again and again and again as sort of her primary motivation for her epistemology. Here, let me.
It's the official epistemology of intersectionality standpoint theory. It's the official epistemology in a lot of left identitarian thought.
Do you have the book on you right now, by any chance?
It's in storage at the moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I have it here, and I want to make sure that I'm sort of interpreting what I'm seeing correctly, because her placement of these citation footnotes is very telling. Let me find the passage right now. Okay, so she says, when she first uses the word epistemology in the chapter, when she introduces it, she says, epistemology constitutes an overarching theory of knowledge. And then she cites Harding, 1987. What this suggests to me, I realize this could be very uncharitable. It seems to me that based on the placement of that citation, Collins seems to think that Harding invented epistemology.
I doubt that. that would be a. I think no, she couldn't possibly think that. I think it suggests. I mean, it's a perfectly workable definition of epistemology. It is a general theory of knowledge. It's an answer to the question, "How do we know?" Which is fine.
But why cite Harding at that point?
Exactly. It seems that her introduction to epistemology might have been Harding. I don't think she's saying that Harding invented it, but I think her introduction and her grounding in epistemology, yeah, I think that does come from Harding. I think that's clear enough, considering she does quite if I remember rightly, she does cite her quite a lot, and the influence is clearly there. But I wouldn't say she's saying that forget all the other philosophers. Sandra Harding invented it.
Yeah. And then a little further down, she says, in general, scholars, publishers, and other experts represent specific interests and credentialing processes, and their knowledge claims must...
Yeah, that's a Harding. That's influenced by Harding, definitely.
And their knowledge claims must satisfy the political and epistemological criteria of the context in which they reside in.
It's verbatim. Yeah, fine. I'll grant you that one, yeah.
And here, though, she actually cites Kuhn, obligatory, Kuhn citation at this point. Let's see. Because this entire enterprise is controlled by elite white men, knowledge validation processes reflect this group's interests. And then another Harding citation.
Did Kuhn actually say that? Where is Kuhn supposed to have uttered those words or written those words?
She deconstructed.
I think
she took apart every word in his book. Then she took apart the letters from the words, deconstructed them, and then she rearranged them.
Put them in a cup like Scrabble pieces. Give it a bit of a shake. Yeah.
That's deconstruction.
I think that's an interpretation. I'd put that down as an interpretation. She's saying, well, if you've read, which is another thing that these kind of postmodernists do. It's they'll cite somebody, but they're citing an interpretation of them. Because they have a lot more leeway with regards to interpretation than we do in the analytic tradition. So that's her interpretation. So she's saying, well, what Kuhn said leads to this clearly. If you read sort of like Sandra Harding and the more radical deconstructivists, it's a little bit unfair. You sort of have to be aware of that if you're reading people who are doing it.
It's eerily similar to when I'm arguing with Christians, one will say this passage implies this, it doesn't say it literally, but you just have to read between the lines, and then another one will say something diametrically opposed.
Yeah, they've read what's between the lines differently, which is very easy to do because it's between the lines.
Yeah,
it's that kind of thing. But yeah, I think you're perfectly correct. There is a link between intersectionality and standpoint. There, it's the official epistemology of intersectionality, taken as a strong theory. I think what happens with intersectionality is it's like a Mott and Bailey thing. I think the Mott, the outward part of the castle, the sort of facade is it's listening to the voices of people who aren't usually heard. Fine, nobody's going to object to that. But once you sort of and a lot of people just will go with that and they'll defend it as that. But once you get to the heart of the castle, there's a sort of like the Bailey, the solid terror of it. There's a much more stronger there's a much more solid core of what's being said. And that's not quite as uncontroversial as the claim that we should listen to the voices of people who aren't usually heard.
This is such intellectual cowardice. I really hate when they do that.
It is a trick. It's a bait and switch. It's intellectual dishonesty to do a Mott and Bailey. It's just to say, well, this is just this. What you can. You're not against. You don't want to silence people who, are you a Nazi? You're terrible. You don't want to be going down that. When really at the core, there's something that's a little bit more dubious, which is a kind of like. It's very much the metaphysics of intersectionality. It reminds me of irreducible complexity.
Yeah.
And that's not cool. That irreducible complexity isn't. You got to question that, and there's dubious causality, especially if you think that the source of knowledge has a causal aspect. Because if you think knowledge has a causal aspect, and you're arguing from standpoints as sort of like second person collective views of emancipatory acts and blah 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 blah, you're almost invoking some kind of downward causation, as if things that are understood as somehow caused by the operation of mind. And there's a word for that. It's called magic, and it doesn't tend to go down too well with people of a naturalistic scientific approach.
Now, with the development of intersectionality, moving on forward with this history, 91, you have initially Collins didn't use the word intersectionality. From what I understand, she wasn't aware of Crenshaw's
black feminist theory. I think he used also a phrase like that, didn't she? Yeah.
And then as the years went by, they called it something else, integrated analysis or something. Yeah. And then there was another paper that was published. Let me pull it up. I have it here somewhere. I believe this is the first time intersectionality was used as it's used today. Let me see. Is it? Yes. Punks, Bulldaggers, and... Hold on. This PDF is... Yeah. Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens by Cohen, 1997. Have you ever heard of that one?
I think I'd remember if I had. It does sound familiar, but it just might be an album. I might be getting in something from the music connection, sort of like.
Maybe. This one was a queer theory paper. Suits cited a lot of times, like over 1,000 or almost 1,000. And at the bottom, I was checking to see which was the first paper that cited both Collins and Crenshaw, because I presume that this would be the first one to apply the word intersectionality to the epistemology that Collins outlined. And this is what came up. So, sort of the genesis of intersectionality as it's used today. There's this thing here, and let me find the passage near the end. 1 second here. Well, it's a long paper. I'll send you the PDF if you're interested. But it basically ends by the entire first part of it. Most of it was dedicated to just queer politics and queer and lesbian epistemology and so on. But in the end, then it starts invoking intersectionality, using the word intersectionality, and says we have to start considering the lived experiences of people of color, of gays, of women. We have to look at all of these different aspects of identity in order to have a full, comprehensive view of how this all works. This sort of seems to me to be kind of this is where Harding's work was basically done. her epistemology was now generalized.
Sure. Yeah. It's the for the Bailey of the argument, the core of the argument. It's the official epistemology is a kind of standpoint theory. The knowledge, that the appropriate knowledge is to be had is to be sort of derived from the standpoint of the underprivileged. Now the standpoint isn't as an individual. The standpoint is of course across it goes for a longer period of time than a single human life. It's a history of a people collectively, of a body, as they say. And that history of emancipatory acts of people freeing themselves yields an interpretation of lived experience, which is the best source of knowledge. And you can see how that fits into Harding. You'd have the thing of they've seen it from both sides. They've seen the master side and they've seen the side of the oppressed, and the harsh treatment that they've undergone has made them more critical, and so. She says, well, therefore, understand. And the thing about good epistemology is how critical it is, and so this is strong objectivity. So you can see it's an assertion of knowledge that those who are underprivileged have actually have epistemic privilege.
This has always bothered me because it seems that there's a kind of non sequitur lurking in there somewhere, and I can't really find where it is. But I feel like it's definitely in there somewhere. I'm not really sure how one gets from I'm in a more oppressed position to I have a better understanding of reality.
It's what you take criticism to be. If you think criticism is just being unjustly treated, being subject to stereotypes, it makes sense. If you don't, which I don't think people coming from the natural sciences tend to think it is, they tend to think of it in terms of a particular procedure, a particular sort of kind of almost Socratic self-knowledge where you know where you'd put your biases and your things, and if you were let to your own devices. So you double blind it and you randomize it, and you put it in the computer so you don't know what's what. If you think it's that, if that's what you think criticism is, you're not going to say, well, okay, being subject to sort of bad treatment, to unjust treatment, it's not particularly going to make you epistemically rigorous. In fact, it's part of your oppression is going to be to keep you dumb. Yeah. So if anything, you're not liberating yourself here. You're almost embracing the master's oppression. Is his ways of keeping you dumb. By he's put these things into your head that they or not put these things into your head, and you're glorifying the thing you've been denied, which he uses because he knows it works, and it yields theories that are accurate and explanatorily strong.
Yeah, there's a tragedy here that I've always noticed. More generally, not just in terms of epistemology, but in terms of the kind of activism that's done, that stems from this master-slave dialectic.
Sure.
The slave defines him or herself in terms of her opposition to the master. Yeah,
and not being the master, and it is tragic. It leads to all kinds of uncomfortable sort of scenarios. At least
it's like
basically.
Mm-hmm. I look at some of the radical feminists on my campus, and some of the people who are obviously into queer theory. You can tell because of the color of their hair and the asymmetrical facial piercings and everything. And I think to myself, what would these people be without the patriarchy? What would they be without heteronormativity? What would they be without?
They're trying so hard not to be. They've uniformed themselves by not being this thing. Yeah, even though the colors and the things might be a rainbow. The thing you're not trying to be, really trying hard not to be with your piercings and all that thing, is the thing that is actually defining you. You're still in chains. You've just painted them.
Yeah, that's really sad. Let me think. There was another thing I wanted to discuss. This might be just me, but there seems to be a tension between the kind of essentialism that is implied by standpoint epistemology, that there is such a thing as a woman's way of knowing or a black person's way of knowing, versus the sort of post-structuralist hatred of essentialism. You know,
Sure.
they really don't.
It's practically, it can be very dogmatic. It can be particularly dogmatic for people of the underprivileged group who disagree with it. It's almost, it is like they've taken a kind of dogmatic authoritarianism and replaced it with another one, as we see in the Hypatia drama. You know, that's an example of that as well, because Rebecca Tuvel is one of their own. She's an left identarian philosopher, and she's transgressed, and you know, and all hell has broken loose. It can be very dogmatic, yeah. And it can be very sort of like essentialist. It can be moral essentialism. That is,
what I'm getting at though is that there seems to be a contradiction, because postmodernists are anti-essentialist. They really don't like essential. They don't like the essentialization of women, of Black people. None of these categories they think exist, and yet these categories have epistemic superiority.
They're not operating on the basis of rational categories, though. Rational categories are sort of abstractions that favour the oppressor. The problem, therefore, being that you may not be quite as critical of your emotional and moral, actually the passionate aspects of this as you could be, and therefore a sort of like a passionate moral kind of essentialism comes in, which is never a good look, especially if you claim to be of the left. And you're supposed to be more, you know, you're supposed to be against these things. Yeah, I think you're right. It isn't. You can't say you can't say, oh, I'm against essentialism, and then start picking on you know, your own sort of like graduates, your people whose dissertation committee, one of the people who signed that and wrote nasty things about it I was actually on her dissertation committee. You can't be that essentialist about morality whilst at the same time claiming to be against essentialism, can you? There's something amiss there. It's like you haven't. It's almost like they're not thinking it through.
Yeah, I see a similar contradiction in post-colonialism. They're cultural relativists, and yet they seem to believe in categorical imperatives.
Yeah, I'd say the normativity, the axiological aspect of the left identarian ideology is normative, and it's deontological. So yeah, it is like categorical imperatives. It's an assessment almost of the intent of the person, and whether that intent is the intent of the privileged, which would lead to bad treatment, unjust treatment, or whether it's in which case it would be evil in the Nietzschean term, or whether it's the intent of the underprivileged, which would lead, if generalized, would just lead to acts of emancipatory acts. So it's almost like black and white, like and that ancient Persian religion, Zarathustra's religion, what was it called, Manichaeism? Yeah, and so that there's the one camp and the other, and you judge whose intent. You judge the intent of people into which camp it would put them. So it becomes almost like a religious morality. Those who are going, the saved and the damned.
But how can they subscribe to this? I mean, even under their own framework,
because people ultimately, it's because people talk about frameworks. But human nature is what it is. It's driven by certain passions, and the value of the frameworks is that it can moderate those passions or make them into virtues when otherwise they would be vices. That's why abstracting away. That's why criticizing frameworks and thinking you're free can be very dangerous, because it can let certain demons in human nature out. That's what it is. You know, this is what people are like if they're not critical and they don't think. They tend to fall into these kind of patterns. And in trying to do good and getting rid of what they think the patterns are the source of the evil, and trying to get rid of the critical framework, the kritikos, they're actually working to make things worse.
Amathia, you called it.
Yes, amathia. Yeah.
Now that we're sort of moving back into post-structuralism, I'm just curious, what do you think of Butler?
I'm not a fan. You could probably.
I'm not a fan of her writing.
Oh, she's. I think Martha Nussbaum was correct. She, Butler has a problem with her writing, but that's that audience I was on about. That's that rock star kind of audience thing that goes on in those circles. She's writing. It's like it's the 21-minute triangle solo on a prog album. Nobody understands it, but it's just that we're chin stroked, and oh yes, that's so deep. I think it's a bit of that going on. She can speak. I've actually spoken to her. I've actually had arguments with her in real life. She can speak clearly enough, so I don't know why she feels she has to go down that road. Well, I do. It's just the explanation I gave. But when she writes, that clarity isn't quite so clear. But yeah, her interpretations of, for example, Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin's performativity, they're not the only ones, shall we say? There are other interpretations of her source material are possible and are reasonable, and that's what often what the Judy fans tend to overlook. They tend to think she's the last word. No, that's not how philosophy works. There are no philosophy Jesuses who come down to earth and tell everybody the truth.
How widely accepted is Butler among biologists anyway? Especially among endocrinologists.
No,
not at all.
Who? They'd be like, who? Oh, right. They might have heard something like that about her, but no, not really. And the interpretations of her fans and their followers, that the interpretations they make of biology and endocrinology aren't particularly widely held in the scientific community either. Again, this is a thing of, I think often we're dealing with a strategy here. We're dealing with a way of getting power rather than a way of making a strong conclusion. Mm-hmm. Establishing a body of knowledge in the academy. I think we're not dealing with that. I think we're dealing with power, a struggle for power and influence, which can be gotten. I mean, seriously, these people back in my day, they were treated like rock stars. It was unbelievable the adulation that these people got in the say late 90s. And I think that's it went away now. Let's come back. These people are like, there's videos on YouTube of young ladies interviewing Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's like they're like, oh, she's my hero worship. It's unbelievable, and that's gonna get to people's heads, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a creepy kind of cult of personality sometimes appearing to emerge. Yep. I'm reminded, by the way, have you ever settled your differences with Concordance on SRY?
I think we've come to an agreement to disagree. I think we've come to it. We agreed to disagree, in that I think that you can credibly say that biological sex is some kind of binary. And you can, and you just have to bite the bullet that in extremely rare cases, we're talking 1,000 to 1,000, so we're talking 1 in a billion. There might be somebody with 2 coincident conditions. That means that even though they are biogenetically male, they have functional female fertility. I can bite that bullet, or I could slightly tweak my definition a little bit in terms of SOX9. And the instigating factor, and solve it. But I still think that biological sex, defined teleologically in terms of the function of the presence of functional SRY, and given the natural history of sexual reproduction, mm-hmm. that's a place where you can draw a distinction, and that's important, I think, because it's a starting point. And as we understand the process better after that, the things that come after it, like the development of sexual identities and so forth, as we better understand that, we can know what we're on about, which is, I think, a good thing.
Yeah, it seems to make sense to me to consider sex as a binary when you consider it in light of evolutionary theory.
Well, yeah, it's meiosis and reproduction, isn't it? At some point, At some point, there's meiosis where it splits into two sets. Yeah, and you need to maintain somehow the integrity of that meiosis, and the way nature does that is by the dimorphism of the gametes generally. Yeah, and then they're mixed and fertilized back together from different sources, and that's you need that for it to be sexual reproduction. So but I think the thing with it, which is odd for people, perhaps, is people are, especially in the field of gender studies and so forth, are used to thinking of sex in terms of classification of the phenomena of the genitals and the secondary sexual characteristics, rather than the more teleological thing where you look at the natural history of a process, and then you do a functional analysis, and then you try and work out what the physical realizers are. That's an odd approach. It's not an odd approach more broadly in the natural sciences. It's actually it's what's called analytic naturalism. It's how that actually works. But it's odd for people who've been told, well, what happens is doctors look at people and they get it wrong, and that's their idea of biological sex is a science sex, which isn't the same thing, because doctors often got it wrong. Doctors didn't know what the bloody hell they were looking at before we knew how genetics worked.
Yeah, gender's a little bit trickier, isn't it?
Sorry, what's a bit trickier?
Gender.
Yeah, because that's not the same thing. It's not determined by biological sex. There is more than two genders. How many genders are there? How many opinions are there? But at the same time, it's not entirely independent of biological sex. It's more like a dual, rather than a spectrum where you have a continuous range. It's more like a dual slit experiment where you have the poles, and then you have like an array of variation. But as you build up this number of samples, it tends to sort of like the cases get closer to the poles. So, biological sex is having some effect, and what gender is it's very much enculturated, but the culture is, in part, what the culture is responding to is the biological sex, or the reproductive imperatives of the biological sex.
Yeah, I feel like there's often an equivocation when it comes to different aspects of gender, gender identity versus gender performance, gender expression, and so on. When I think of gender, I just think of gender identity. I don't, if a guy is wearing a dress and he identifies as a man, I still think of his gender as being male, regardless of whether he's wearing something that's culturally, the cultural aspect is irrelevant when I'm thinking about gender. Gender expression doesn't come into play at all for me when I think of gender.
But wearing a dress would be an expression of a female gender. So slightly away, there's some variation there, and that's what it is. It's variation, but this is the thing: all natural systems are full of variation. And by the time we get to psychology, my God, there's a great deal of variation. And I can't help thinking whether what's breaking down here is the expectation that very simple metaphysics applies to complex natural systems. Which they don't tend to directly. We use them as part of our means of describing and predicting natural systems, but we shouldn't write them into the ontological essence of what's being described. There's variations in natural systems, including the psychology of sexual identity. You're right. They're not going to fit into sort of themistic metaphysics or into sort of binaries that Plato liked. They're just not. But that's not to say, which is where it goes too far, that you can't even mention the phrase biological sex, which is without doing violence, which is just bizarre, or that one's gender or anything about one as a human being is a completely free existential choice. We're natural beings. We're situated in the natural order.
Yeah, their view seems to be that if we change the institutions, if we change, what the media shows us, what family values are taught to us, what the education system teaches, that people will, all of the genders, and it's going to be, if you plot the number of people on the y-axis that there are versus all of the different genders on the x-axis, you're going to end up with a kind of continuous,
spectrum,
even distribution. Yeah.
But when people do things like that, that's not the case. You get more like the dual split. You get statistically the variation centers around the poles.
Yeah. This, though, they will attribute to heteronormativity. They'll say that it's because the system is the way it is that people are not being allowed to express themselves, or they don't even know that they're not.
Yeah, but then in the next breath they'll claim, well, there's no evidence to say it isn't, which is a fallacy. Or they'll say, in the absence of evidence. I mean, I think there is evidence, but certain people like Philip Moriarty, for example, he was claiming there's no evidence. But if there's no evidence, to put it down to nurture rather than nature is a Jamesian will to believe, which is the complete opposite of evidentialism. Jamesian will to believe, where there's a proposition and there's no evidence either way, so it's in the middle. You're a Gnostic, you don't know, but it's an important issue, and on the basis of that, you'll decide whether it's to believe it or not. It's basically sort of like what's it called? Pascal's wager. That's the complete opposite of evidentialism. If you're an evidentialist, you say, I don't know. You don't say, oh, it's this because this is what I want ideologically.
Yeah. Where do you think this fear comes from? This fear of describing human, psychology and human interactions in society in naturalistic terms. I mean, I realize that there's a historical element to it, but surely at some level they must realize that, that's not going to happen again.
Well, it could happen again. But the thing is, there's that clearly, but it also comes from being misled by Prussians. It becomes from that particular line of continental thought that goes through the Neo-Kantians, to the Hegelians, back to a certain interpretation, a phenomenalistic interpretation of transcendental idealism. Which tends to say no, social sciences, and this is the kind of man. It's best expressed like Max Weber and people like that, and it comes from that sort of stream and Heidegger and people like that. And it says, well, no, there has to be some kind of phenomenalistic first-person content to it. It has to be more like storytelling or theatre criticism than natural science. Otherwise, and this is where the post-war thing comes in. Otherwise, it's going to be used to control and oppress people. The capitalists are going to grab hold of it and blind people to them being exploited.
But why does the possession of consciousness and language make us, transcend our status as biological entities?
It doesn't in reality. But the idea that it does, it seems to protect us against what's seen as a hostile technocratic world run by exploitative interests, the horror of the machine, the culture industry and its abuse of our humanity for its own ends, etc., etc. And the sense
that's an argument from consequence.
Oh yeah, it is an argument from consequence, and and it's also somewhat self-serving, and it's not a good argument. And there's it is a fear. It's the fear that if naturalism is true, then determinism is true, and morality is lost, and humanity is lost, and it's all over. It's the premature heat death of the universe in each individual's head simultaneously. But naturalism doesn't entail that. That's their conception perhaps does, but that's not the conception of naturalists. And really, there's the people you want to be talking to if you want to know about naturalism. Yeah. Does that make sense, or did you just babble on then?
I'll go back and listen to that a few times.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I heard Heidegger and Max Weber and a lot of other things, but I'll look into that, I guess.
Yeah, there's basically an anti-positive, what's called an anti-positivist or an anti-naturalist tradition. That you can trace back to Kant and the transcendental ideal and a phenomenalist reading of it, and it goes through Hegel. It resurfaces in the late 19th century with the Neo-Kantians, who in turn were influential with Max Weber and Heidegger, and of course the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer. I
read The Authoritarian Personality recently.
All right, yes.
It's very biased, I think, against
somewhat, yes. It was an exercise in Nazi spotting. Yeah. People love it today. Mind you, you don't need an exercise today. You just call people Nazis. It's just what they are.
That's fallen out of fashion. Now you call them pedophiles.
Oh, really? I can't help thinking they're running out of a fence headroom here. I can't remember, about a fortnight away from a paedophilic Nazi cannibal. You know, and then where do you go from there?
They haven't called anyone a necrophiliac yet.
Oh, let's come in. We're about fortnight. Give it a fortnight, Crocodile. Give it a fortnight.
What are they going to do when they run out? I mean, I was once called, to my bewilderment at the time, a heteronormative fuck. I didn't understand what that meant at the time, and I wasn't even sure if I'd been insulted or complimented.
Oh, good grief! I know it's if your approach has descended, and I speak as somebody who's very much of the left. If your approach has descended to name calling, you are in trouble. You really are.
That reminds me, I have a kind of self-reflective fear. I'm a little bit afraid of becoming a bit too McCarthyian when it comes to my criticism. I've been using this word Lysenkoism a lot in describing some of the trends that I see. I'm wondering if I'm going too far, or if if it's an appropriate characterization of the sort of mindset we're dealing with.
It's a particular case from history of where ideology gets the better of science, and a lot of people suffer for it. So it's a good example. Whether it's a comprehensive school or something that you could, I don't know whether maybe I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't say Lysenkoism is what I'd call it. I'd give Lysenko as a very good example of and of course the Deutsche Physik as well as an example where ideology can just go try and dominate the scientific enterprise. Because it is relevant to what is happening. There is an ambition there. I don't think anybody can deny there's an ambition. I mean, you talk about Sandra Harding and people like that. Nobody can deny there's really an ambition to try and bully science in the way that they bully the arts.
My thinking with Lysenkoism, though, is that there's an underlying epistemology that maybe not necessarily have been articulated at the time, but which finds expression with the work of Harding and Keller. Very, very strange case, Keller. I'll get to her in a moment. She's actually a theoretical physicist who somehow drank this Kool-Aid. But there's this view that science, having been developed in a particular culture, is an expression of that culture's ideals. Back to natural selection and the capitalist thing. Which now that I realize that professor was literally endorsing a Lysenkoist talking point. But whatchamacallit? So you determine sort of, how do I put this? If you look into the feminist empiricism aspect of feminist epistemology in particular, the so-called empiricism, where you have a stronger objectivity by introducing the female kind of cognitive patterns into scientific thinking, and you have all these screeds about how Barbara McClintock, she was operating under this, and you can have a more successful science if you integrate the feminine way of thinking as opposed to this androcentric way of thinking. There seems to be a very strong parallel here to what Lysenko did. Let's introduce this kind of this Soviet science, rather than this bourgeois science.
Yeah, the right do it as well with creationism. It's the forceful insertion of ideological wishful thinking into a approach that benefits, that works better for not having that, for guarding against it. Science is structured to resist that, and so that it can achieve a view of truth, and it's an attempt to take down those defenses that science has and introduce a glorious vision of a perfect world.
In my experience, though, creationism is a bit different because it doesn't try to alter sort of the structure of science. It tries to work within the structure of science by saying, no, this evidence is fake, and then here's this evidence, and so and so.
That's because science has that's because this is bizarre, because creationists have more respect for the status of science in society than left identitarians do.
That is really fucking sad.
I know that's a creepy thing, but I think it's true. It's like the right have gone, well, science is, maybe it's because the right is kind of rooted in a slightly earlier time, like the immediate post-war. Like the Christian right is still, a lot of its thinking is more reminiscent of the late 40s, early 50s, and Sputnik paranoia and all of that, which was the time when that kind of Cold War thing came out. And we can't directly badmouth science now. Science is what's keeping us free from the commies and all that. And so there's still a bit more of that. Maybe that's going away now. Maybe there will be people on the right who think that they can sort of alt-fact science.
What I call Lysenkoism generally is just this attempt to alter the structure of the scientific enterprise and the structure of scientific inquiry, and to try to introduce this kind of plurality of politically based science. All of science is situated. I guess it follows in the Marxist tradition of saying that all epistemologies are situated.
Yeah, and they're all, and conveniently for them, they're always situated in something that's conducive to their worldview and their grand plans. That's what it is. It's always situated in such a way as that we can make it better by enforcing our theory, our standpoint upon it. This is a left and a right thing, but it's something to very much be resisted, I think, because it'd be the destruction of something that is quite vulnerable and very, very valuable, because knowing the truth can help us do a lot of things. Like I'm talking to you on the other side of the planet now in real time.
Yeah. And also, the carrying capacity of the planet with regard to the human race without science is much smaller than it is with science.
Sure. Oh yeah. With the planet's in trouble, and
the planet's fine. The people are fucked, as Carlin would have said.
It's the natural system in which we're a part is not healthy, and we need to deal with that. And if we think we're going to do it on the basis of ideology rather than actually respect for truth, then boy, are we in for a bad time.
Yeah. You said this is the thing on the right as well. I agree. In the case of Deutsche Physics in particular, I would consider that a sort of a subset of Lysenkoism, even though that was in Nazi Germany. Sure. I use the term Lysenkoism because it sort of came before. It was kind of the first major case, as far as I'm aware, where this kind of balkanization of science had transpired. Would you agree?
I think it's an earlier case. Yes, I think it's the early 30s as opposed to the sort of, because it contributed to the Ukrainian famine. I believe it did. I think something like that contributed, and Deutsche Physics was 37, 38. But there's a lot of similarities between Nazism and Stalinist communism. They both had a tendency to try and have a controlling, overarching vision, and controlling, overarching visions can be very appealing to human nature, especially when people feel alienated, or they don't feel that there's anything in their lives that gives them meaning or worth fighting for.
This is why Hegel is so poisonous.
Well, yeah, Hegel can certainly be used to abuse that and play to it in a way that isn't healthy. Whereas a critical scientific attitude, if you do actually accept rational arguments that you might find uncomfortable, rather than attack people in journals for them, it yields some protection against the worst excesses of which humans are capable.
All right. So I've run out of things that I wanted to cover. Or wait, no, hang on. There's also the other three I wanted to talk about really quickly. Evelyn Fox Keller, Helen Longino, and what's her name? There were three big ones: Evelyn Fox Keller, Helen Longino, and her name is escaping me. Maybe I'll look it up really quickly. Hold on.
Okay.
while we wait, where did your dislike of Hegel come from? Because mine sort of was inherited from Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies.
Yeah, I think there is I think people like Oakeshott and Popper and those immediate post-war more conservative thinkers, I think their attribution of Hegel, as they basically blamed Hegel for the kind of extremism that was a blight of communism and Nazism. I think there's something to that. I know there are counter arguments, but I find them less convincing than the arguments. I think Hegel is a bit of an extremist enabler. In my case, I generally don't tend to like Neoplatonic thought. And I think there's something of Neoplatonism in Hegel and in sort of like early German idealists, like all of them basically, except for Schelling. I think Schelling redeemed himself a bit towards the 1840s.
Bertrand Russell was the same, wasn't he?
Yeah, but Russell was like, well, this is the kind of extremism we're fighting in the world now. This is where this comes from. And it's right that either both the Nazis and the communists can be traced back in infamy to sort of certain strands of German idealist thought, Prussian idealist thought. Yeah. And I don't like that. I'm English empirical analytic. I'm a sort of like perhaps it's a national characteristic. I like gardening, not standing on atop of mountain tops conducting thunderstorms.
You are situated after all. So Donna Haraway, that's the one.
Okay.
The primate lady.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So with the exception, I think, of Helen Longino, these three have all had scientific training. Haraway in primatology and zoology. Keller in theoretical physics, which came as a bit of a shocker to me. How does such people get to this point? Because I was reading the transcript for an interview that Keller did, and she was saying at one point that probing high energies with particle physics, that this was a kind of act of violence against nature.
This is odd, yeah, because I wonder, one of the signatories on the 2-vol letter, or one of the people who commented on it, was Nora Bernstein. And Nora Bernstein has done some good philosophy of science stuff with modality, but she was claiming Duval enacts violence by using the term biological sex and male genitalia. And I was thinking, what's going on here? There's somebody who can clearly do this, clearly think clearly and rigorously, and then they end up sort of doing this. What's going on? And I don't know. The mysteries of the human heart. Is it just a careerist thing? Is it easy to do this kind of easier to make a career doing this low rent poetry rather than rigorous research? I have no idea. I suspect it isn't that this is actually as rigorous of research as one does in the STEM fields or in analytic philosophy. I'm pretty sure that isn't the case.
Yeah, because I've been looking through their papers. I've been trying to get at their arguments, and it's really bad.
Yeah, when you do parse it in a kind of analytic way, in a way that these people know you can do, because I've seen them do it in their own, especially when it's earlier work. It's like people reach a point in their career where they go, "Oh God, this actually doing this for real is hard work." But I tell you what, there's this kind of stuff over here that you can do, and you can get your publications under your belt. You can be treated like a rock star. You become a name in the circles. Oh, this is a much easier. It's almost like an economic incentive. You know what I mean? It's more like that they're incentivized to not do it properly. I'm going to say it now. Then to do the soft stuff, to do the easy option.
When this comes down to problems in academic culture, publish or perish.
Capitalism is rubbish in academic culture. The incentives of neoliberal markets don't work in academic culture. It's one of the places where they don't work. It's one of the places where the externalities and the bad information get the better of them, and there's market failure. Clearly, I mean, I'm not denying that the sort of like the left-wing radicals aren't a problem. They bloody certainly are, believe me. But yeah, there's problems with it. There's problems with right-wing ideology in academic culture as well. And I think don't get me wrong. I'm
I'm not the, I know I've endorsed Academic Agent and I've talked about Thomas Sowell. I'm not completely sold on free market capitalist stuff either. So, I'm sort of a little bit in the undecided kind of position. I do like regulations. I do like, I do like the idea of a welfare state, but I'm not quite as sure anymore if its execution right now is the best.
I'm working on my next response to Academic Agent. Actually, we're in the middle of a discourse at the moment about the merits and drawbacks of distributive justice.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
But yeah, I think there just seem to be some incentive for people to not have to publish the stuff where you have to work really hard, and where you can just fall back into a kind of vague, kind of poetic approach to philosophy, where people will be agreeing with you because they like the cut of your jib rather than the details of your argument, the cut of your ideological jib rather than the actual technical bits. I know that's by the way is a terrible slanderous thing for me to say, but I just said it anyway. Live with it.
All right. Well, do you have any parting thoughts? Anything you want to add before we close this up?
No, it's been fun. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Okay.
All right, everybody.
Bye-bye.
This has been Gary Edwards and I, and we are signing off then. Have a good one.
Bye.